FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
I remembered in writing this book involuntarily a line from a great old rock and roll song by Elvis Presley that was a gospel song originally. It was a top 10 hit. It was a worldwide hit. It was called Crying in the Chapel, for some of you old-timers who may recall. And the line of the song hit me. You saw me crying in the chapel. The tears I shed were tears of joy. I know the meaning of contentment now. I am happy with the Lord. And I thought, wow, to feel that sense of joy and contentment and happiness. I mean, what else are we here on earth for, perhaps, except to feel those kinds of emotions? And that's why I'm envious of people who feel them. That's why I feel spiritual envy. That's why I had to name it and signify it as spiritual envy. Because it's something that I lost. And it's a common enough story, I mean, I lost my faith, I suppose, for the reason most people do. Well, I suppose many people lose their faith because of tragedy and because life doesn't measure up to what they had hoped for or prayed for. But I wanted to be an intellectual, and I read a lot of science, and I read Darwin, and I read Nietzsche, and I read Schopenhauer, and all of the great thinkers, and Socrates, who is really an agnostic, who said, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. I read Bertrand Russell, who was an early idol of mine, and I read the agnostics. I talk about somewhat irreverently in this book the trinity of agnostics. Bertrand Russell being one of them. He was variously an atheist and an agnostic, depending on his audience. Another being Robert Ingersoll, who was known as the great agnostic. And T.H. Huxley, Aldous Huxley's grandfather, who was the man who gave us the word agnostic and who was known as Darwin's bulldog. I was drawn more and more to agnosticism as an answer to things that aren't answerable. And I was also coming to a kind of light bulb above my head and realization that what I had lost of my childhood in the way of faith was something very precious. Was something that represented, can I use a word like cherishable? I don't even know if it's what we call a neologism, a word that you can invent that comes out of actual words. Something that deserved to be cherished. That is, when I call it precious and cherish, I mean, when I was a boy, I was absolutely certain that God was watching over me. And I write in the book about not only the comfort of that, but I went through something that, by any standards, was pretty traumatic. I had a teacher, a male teacher in the 6th grade, and I've never seen myself as a victim, frankly. There are lots of people who talk about abuse, and unfortunately they use it in an abusive way to gain sympathy, either internally or from others. It just happens to be a fact that when I was in the 6th grade, I was kind of an active kid and sometimes spoke out of turn and spoke without raising my hand. And this was a kind of old British type of school teacher, I mean from the old school, Swinburne, that type of thing, who would take me literally by the ear and haul me into the boys' restroom and punch and kick and slap and physically abuse me. Even one occasion, sticking my head into a toilet. And I did what I think people need to do when they go through anything resembling this kind of trauma. I moved on with my life, and I didn't let it haunt me. I processed it somehow, and frankly, I didn't think about it that much because I wanted to move on with my life, and I was a young, ambitious kid, and I wanted to succeed, and there you have it in a nutshell. But it came back to me. A lot of it came back to me in writing this book, and I didn't dwell on it because I didn't want to dwell on it. I never wanted to dwell on it. But what I realized was this. I was getting, as we used to say, getting my ass kicked, literally. And I wanted to be good. I wanted him to think I was a good kid, a good boy, okay? And I also was intelligent enough to realize that by trying to be good, I wouldn't necessarily incur his wrath and I wouldn't get my ass kicked. Okay? That's a word that's permissible on the radio, by the way. FCC regulations allow it. So I was helping him. I became his helpmate. I began to, put drawings up and clear off the chalkboard and do all these kinds of things. And he asked me to take a can of paint to the room across the hall to the other 6th grade teacher, and I slipped, and the paint went down the whole corridor like a miniature river, yellow paint. And he used to come out, aside from taking me to the boys' room to beat up, he would come out to have a cigarette in the boys' room. And he comes out to the boys' room to have a cigarette, and he sees me standing there, with all this yellow paint going down the corridor. Quite a sight it must have been. But he became ferociously angry and gave me the worst beating he ever gave me. And he said, "Mop it up," and I did. And I was standing there, trying to keep the tears in and everything, because, I came from this kind of neighborhood where you never showed emotion lest you be thought of as a sissy. Somebody might see the tears streaming down my face. I kept them in. It's hard. Mopped it up, left, and then went to a little wooded area and started sobbing convulsively. I mean, I can remember it pretty graphically. But I also remember what I said inwardly. And what I said inwardly was, "I was good. God, you know." I didn't even tell my parents about this abuse until years later, because he was my teacher. He was the authority. I was the bad boy. But that certainty that God is up there watching you and knowing that you're good, even when you've been beaten, even when something really so unjust has occurred. I mean, because what can be more unjust than the beating of a child? And it took years and years later, after having read Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov, before I began to think to myself, Ivan Karamazov is right when he says, how can a loving, compassionate God allow such a thing as the beating of a child? And this is called theodicy, not the Odyssey, Theodicy, the theodicy. That is, that you have to come to some kind of justification for God in a world where there's evil and where there's child molestation and hurricanes and earthquakes and terrible wars and so forth, if you believe. How can you reconcile it? I mean, our founding fathers reconciled it quite easily. They said, we're deists. God made the world and created it. I always am reluctant to speak about our founding fathers because it makes me feel like Glenn Beck. But, look at Jefferson and Hamilton, Madison. I mean, they all believed God made the world, and then he kind of became absent, as it were, and it was up to us in free will to follow his commands and to follow his dictates and to live lives of goodness. Well, I wanted a code, and I think I found one to live by.